I can't stop thinking about mouthwashing, and despite it being out for a year at this point, I failed to find an analysis or reading on the site that really captures my thoughts. So here we go again. As you may know, mouthwashing is a dark psychological horror experience, so it's got its fair share of shocking moments. It's also got an absurd premise. We follow the crew of a wrecked space freighter living off its cargo hold full of alcoholic mouthwash. It's certainly a unique flavor pairing of morbid and outlandish, if you will. But what makes mouthwashing exceptional is its tale of working class struggle, and the interpersonal trauma that results from it. This is unfortunately quite easy for many of us to relate to nowadays. Despite the setting of an interplanetary freighter like the Tulpar and all that it implies, the future presented by mouthwashing resembles our present reality a bit too closely. And throughout this story of struggle, the words "take responsibility" flash on the screen from time to time. Which, given the interpersonal strife and the dark places it goes, this has naturally sparked a lot of conversation here on YouTube. Many readings and breakdowns of mouthwashing focus on the horrific events of the game and attempt to chase down an answer to the question of, whose responsibility is it? And I just want to say that I don't think these analyses are wrong, per se. For the most part, they correctly assess many aspects of the story. It's quite natural for us to think of responsibility in very individualistic terms. So-and-so is at fault for this problem. This person is responsible for this happening. But this focus on individual actors in the narrative, while frequently accurate, also feels incomplete. If you will permit me a cliche here, I think this is missing the forest for the trees. So I'd like to offer a different perspective. Because, reflecting on it, I think mouthwashing is criticizing this very framing of personal responsibility. The game often highlights the perniciousness of this individualistic mentality. Like being caught in quicksand, the atomized crew members of the Tulpar do things of their own accord that cause the situation to go from bad to worse. Put another way, mouthwashing demonstrates that this fixation on personal responsibility is a trap. But where does this mentality come from? Why is it simultaneously easy to fall into, yet hard to get out of? Is this just human nature, or is something else at play here? And why does this whole situation feel so uncannily familiar? With these questions in mind, I'd like to present to you how mouthwashing perfectly captures our collective waking nightmare. That is, the nightmare of life under neoliberalism. There are already plenty of videos here on YouTube recapping mouthwashing's plot, so I won't exhaustively rehash all of it here. Instead, my goal is to quickly summarize the important beats and character moments. This should also serve as a spoiler warning. If anything I've mentioned about mouthwashing so far appeals to you, I think you should go and check it out. It's only about 2 hours long, and so you can easily run through it and come back here afterward. Alright, you've been warned, so here we go. We join life aboard the Pony Express freighter Tulpar and get to know its crew. We have the ship's mechanic Swansea, a middle-aged family man whose ordinarily surly demeanor gives way to empathy and concern for his crewmates when things go south. Apprenticing under him is Daisuke, a fresh-faced intern whose lack of practical skills contrasts quite sharply with his abundance of optimism and bravado. Next up is the ship's medic, Anya, who took the job because Pony Express was quite lenient about her lack of formal credentials. While on screen, Anya generally presents as timid and squeamish. This is most likely due to the proximity of one of our player characters. It seems she's much more affable towards the other crew members when he's not around. Speaking of our player characters, yes, we play as these two guys. We briefly inhabit Captain Curly's perspective in a couple of the chronologically earlier segments of the story. Curly is a veteran freighter captain who, despite this successful career, is looking to do something else with his life. As a favor, he helps a troubled friend land a spot on the Tulpar as his co-pilot. This would be Jimmy. Jimmy. Jimmy is our primary player character, and Jimmy is a real piece of work, if you catch my meaning. Throughout the story, Jimmy is shown to have a short fuse. He carries with him what sociologist Michael Kimmel might describe as aggrieved entitlement. This leads Jimmy to harass and eventually assault Anya, which I won't get into more detail here due to YouTube's content moderation policies. Needless to say, this is why she behaves so very differently when Jimmy is around. Life aboard the Tulpar doesn't seem all that peachy, even before the proverbial shit hits the fan, i.e. when the ship hits an asteroid. It's over a year-long voyage for the crew, who all must adhere to the rather dystopian corporate policies of Pony Express. These include medical expenses being docked from employees' pay, sleep being restricted to 5 hours a day, and threatened collective punishment for poor team synergy. The cherry on top of this shit sundae is Mouthwashing's inciting incident. Captain Curly receives a fax from corporate, and, you see, a fax is like an email, but, anyhow, Captain Curly reads this
email,
and he's got to deliver some really bad news to the crew. Pony Express is going out of business, which means they're all unemployed at the conclusion of this delivery. This is devastating news for sure, and Jimmy crashes out. Quite literally. In the first scene of the game, we play as an unidentified crew member who disables the ship's autopilot and steers the Tulpar into the asteroid. We learn later that this was Jimmy, and Curly finds him shortly after this. But it's too late for Curly to avert disaster, try as he may. The Tulpar crashes into the asteroid, causing emergency foam to seal off any potential or actual hull breaches. Curly is horribly disfigured in the crash, incapacitated but somehow still alive. This also leaves Jimmy in the position of acting captain, unfortunately. The Tulpar is adrift in space, and the ship's food supply is starting to run thin. This compels the crew to open the cargo hold, against company regulations I might note, where they find cases upon cases of alcoholic mouthwash. On one hand, this is something of a blessing. The sugar in it is a source of calories. On the other hand, well, 5 people in a dire situation gaining access to large quantities of alcohol is a surefire recipe for disaster. And surely enough, this cake of disaster is baked. Anya eventually locks herself in the medical bay and is unresponsive. The only other way in is through a vent from the utility room below, and this particular vent has been shown to be in a state of hazardous disrepair. On top of this, Swansea has steadfastly prevented anyone from entering said utility room ever since the crash, under the pretense that it is full of emergency foam and anyone messing around would risk venting the entire ship. With their goal to reach the medbay via the vent, Jimmy and Daisuke mix together a cocktail potent enough to black out the lapsed alcoholic Swansea. We learn exactly why Swansea was so protective about the utility room. Only one of the ship's 4 cryopods survived the crash, and this was dangerous knowledge given the already tense situation aboard the Tulpar. Coming back to the Anya situation, Jimmy orders Daisuke to climb up the hazardous vent and unlock the medical bay. Daisuke succeeds in doing so, but is gravely wounded in the process. Worse yet, we discover Anya's fate. She fatally overdosed on the last of the ship's painkiller supply. Without any means to stabilize Daisuke's condition, Swansea mercy kills him. Soon after, Jimmy finds the ship's gun, and it's at this point that Swansea snaps, going after Jimmy with an axe. This is the point of the game where we as players start experiencing less and less of the literal reality of what is going on aboard the Tulpar. Instead, we drift in and out of metaphorical vignettes reflecting Jimmy's psyche. Eventually, Jimmy comes out on top in this lethal struggle, executing Swansea after allowing him a few final words. But looking around, Jimmy at least has some recognition of just how badly he has failed as acting ship's captain. He then turns to the only other surviving crew member, his mentor. Our perspective pivots to Curly one last time as Jimmy places us in the last functioning cryopod. We see Jimmy walk out of sight, hear the sound of a gunshot, and the credits roll. This is a remarkably bleak story, And given that Mouthwashing develops its characters so well despite its short running time, it's natural that our focus is drawn towards them and each of their roles in this tragedy. What was Swansea planning to do with the only remaining cryopod? What exactly is wrong with Jimmy? And is Curly guilty of enabling him? I want to stress that zeroing in on such questions is completely understandable and not necessarily a wrong or incorrect approach to the subject matter either. For the record, yeah, I think Curly is culpable for failing to listen to Anya and to protect her from his so-called friend. But again, my issue here is that this emphasis on personal responsibility misses the bigger picture. Or worse, this individual focus could be running directly counter to the core thematic concern that Mouthwashing might be trying to draw our attention towards. Let's reflect upon the last act of the game. Repeatedly, Jimmy proclaims to himself and others that he can and is going to fix things. He takes unilateral action to address problems. He is, in his own way, taking responsibility. The results are horrific. As a consequence of Jimmy's efforts to fix things, 3 of the Tulpar's crew are dead. Aside from Jimmy, the rest of the crew act out of their own personal volition without consulting each other, which further exacerbates the situation. Curly insisting on single-handedly dealing with Jimmy's obviously harmful behaviors, Swansea keeping the secret of the utility room to himself, Anya taking the gun case and going solo and confronting Jimmy about her pregnancy. This whole situation resembles a prisoner's dilemma, where a group of agents can't communicate with or trust one another. This leads them to decide on courses of action that they believe to be in their best self-interest as individuals, but ultimately results in a worse outcome for all involved. So why can't the crew of the Tulpar trust one another? Certainly Jimmy's behavior is a major factor here. It's completely reasonable for Anya to not trust Jimmy, and by extension to be wary of Curly as well. But I think we ought to resist the urge to pin this all on Jimmy. Firstly, Swansea and Daisuke don't have the same sort of baggage, and yet there still seems to be a significant lack of trust between those two and between them and Anya as well. Secondly, as we're seeing, this obsession with individual responsibility is precisely how we got into this mess. So instead of asking, why is Jimmy like this, and focusing on his moral fiber or attempting to pathologize him, I think we need to zoom out and examine the systems at play here. What kind of society or culture produces a person like Jimmy? Or why is it so hard to trust the people around us nowadays? From where I sit, these are far more interesting and insightful questions to ask and explore. And as far as systems go, we should probably start with the elephant, or rather, the pony in the room.
And security, enormous profits, no strikes. Remember, you're the big boss. Government control.
Now, I haven't watched every single analysis of Mouthwashing on this site, but several folks have commented on the game's satirical depiction of capitalism. Unfortunately, most of these videos only make a passing remark about this. An exception is Unajoy's excellent analysis, which I think you should check out if you're curious. But yes, Mouthwashing quite clearly demonstrates the destructiveness of capitalism. All right, I can already hear some of you out there. Another lefty YouTuber is saying capitalism bad? How innovative. I understand that it can be somewhat annoying that many of us raise this observation as a pithy, self-evident truth. It can certainly seem like we've got our heads in our hymnals here, either the Communist Manifesto or the Conquest of Bread, depending on denomination. From these hymnals, we lift our heads and let out a dutiful capitalism sucks in lieu of an amen. So you know what? I'm going to take some time here to describe exactly why people on the left side of the political spectrum hate capitalism. And I'm sure as hell not going to posture myself as some sort of impartial, apolitical centrist in order to do so. Because, to be quite frank with you, I'm not sure that such a person truly exists. I think we should all be highly skeptical of anyone who makes such claims about themselves, especially if they're trying to convince people of something. I'm sharing with you my sincerely held thoughts, opinions, and beliefs as a socialist, a position that I've arrived at independently through study and life experience, not through dogma. All I ask of you is to have an open mind, to consider what I say. If anything shocks or upsets you, I encourage you to be introspective about why you feel that way and to do further learning into anything that piques your curiosity or suspicion. Okay? So why do us lefties hate capitalism so much? Well, first, what even is a capitalism? Let's dispense with a few myths and misunderstandings. Capitalism is not the existence of money. Capitalism first emerged somewhere around 500 years ago, while forms of currency predate the dawn of recorded history. For reference, that's well over 7,000 years ago.
Looking at the history of money itself, remember, we have this paradigm. First there is barter, then there's money, then comes credit, and that's wrong. Not only is it wrong, it's actually backwards.
Likewise, capitalism is not commerce. Pretty much the same thing there. Humans have been trading and exchanging goods for millennia before capitalism arrived. It should go without saying, then, that capitalism is not natural. The human species, Homo sapiens, has been on this planet in our current physiological form for somewhere around 200,000 years. Capitalism has only been the dominant economic system for around 200 years of that time, or roughly 0.1% of humanity's existence. This fact should obviously cause a great degree of skepticism toward any claim that capitalism is human nature. And as a quick tangent, I find human nature to be a silly concept. We certainly have self-preservation instincts, and that can certainly make us selfish pricks from time to time, and like other mammals, we clearly have some social behaviors that are hardwired into us. But it's kind of ridiculous to try to boil all of human existence down to either we're fundamentally greedy, selfish individuals, or we're instinctively communal, and then make an argument that we should do what is most natural for us. I say this because one critical aspect of Homo sapiens are our massive, buxom, voluptuous frontal lobes. It's silly to argue about what is instinctual for us because our key defining trait as a species is our ability to override said instincts. We can do stuff like jump out of planes or go cave diving. Well, you won't find me doing such things, but the point stands. The truth is, humans are complex. So, pardon me if I find most conversations around human nature to be incredibly reductive. Anyhow, tangent over. To get back to it, when we on the left criticize capitalism, we aren't criticizing the use of money or commerce or anything along those lines, though we have thoughts about those as well. What we are criticizing is a very specific set of economic relations, a particular mode of production. Our focus is on how commodities are produced, who does the work of producing them, and who owns them afterward. It's in this way that capitalism divides humanity into two distinct classes: capitalists and workers. What defines the capitalist class is the ownership of exclusive private property, which should not be confused with personal possessions. Your personal possessions are the things you use in your day-to-day life. The home you live in, if you're lucky enough to own one, your car, your PC, your amiibos, etc. Private property, on the other hand, is stuff like factories, mineral quarries, even intellectual property such as trademarks and copyrights. A key aspect of private property is that its owner, a capitalist, is entitled to anything produced by or with said private property. To understand class relations, let's take the example of a factory. In order for a factory to produce commodities which he can sell, the capitalist must staff it with workers. Through the labor of these workers, raw materials are transformed into an end product, an output which is considerably more valuable than the cost of its inputs. Now, the factory owner could pay his workers the exact value their labor produced, which would be fair, but we know this doesn't happen under capitalism. The capitalist will take the lion's share of the profit and only pay his employees as much of a wage to keep them showing up to work. This is our first major criticism of capitalism. It is exploitative. The workers generate massive value, of which the capitalist pockets a vast majority. But even in the case where this factory owner only skimmed, say, 1% of the profit for himself, he would still be profiting off the work of his labor force. By definition, this is exploitation. So why does the capitalist pay his employees as little as possible? Is he just a greedy jerk? Well, maybe, but under capitalism, it really doesn't matter what his disposition is. He is compelled to be a greedy jerk by market imperatives. First and foremost, he is competing with other capitalists. Now sure, he might win more of a share of the market by selling higher quality products for a better price, but Come on, you know this is pretty naive. In the competition between capitalists, the greatest advantage is profit. The capitalist enterprise generating the most profit can expand its production through capital reinvestment. It can build new factories and buy better equipment, hire more workers, and broaden its distribution network. A highly profitable enterprise can advertise aggressively, as well as undercut its competition for long enough to squeeze them out of the market, perhaps eventually buying them out. More profitable companies can also run up the score by attracting more outside investment than their peers, compounding this incredible advantage further. Making a better product and treating your employees and customers with respect and dignity is, well, just not the most profitable approach in the long term, sadly. If you want to make obscene amounts of money, driving out competition and securing a dominant market share for yourself is your surest bet. Here, you can charge your clientele an arm and a leg for substandard merchandise while paying sweatshop wages to your employees. And once you're already making profit hand over fist, this only gets easier to do. Just like a game of poker, under capitalism, the big stack has a considerable advantage over those with fewer chips. This brings me to the second and third major criticisms we leftists have regarding capitalism. For the second, the meta for winning in capitalism is ridiculously simple. Grow your profits faster than everyone else and keep growing them year over year. In other words, infinite growth, or the logic of cancer cells. Capitalism is a tumor that will metastasize and, yes, eventually kill its host. Third, as I outlined here, the most surefire way to generate explosive profits is to be as ruthless and cutthroat as possible. I cannot emphasize this enough. The problem with capitalism isn't that it is a good or even neutral system that has somehow been co-opted or corrupted by evil people. Capitalism is a system that selects for the most cruel, pitiless, and immoral individuals to be its leaders. A CEO who doesn't prioritize maximizing profits for his shareholders will surely be replaced by one who does. This is why I don't personally advocate for taking our current set of capitalist billionaires and, say, giving them a haircut. Unless they stubbornly cling to their wealth and behave in counter-revolutionary ways, well, maybe we take a little off the top in that case. Because without replacing the capitalist system, we'd just have a new set of ruthless asshole capitalist billionaires in a couple of weeks, if not sooner. Still free Luigi, though. Another key thing I want to stress is that it's not necessarily about how much money a person has, but rather how they make their money. It would be ridiculous, for instance, to equate someone who just won the lottery with a capitalist just because their bank accounts have a matching number of digits. Likewise, consider professional athletes who make millions of dollars each year by selling their uniquely skilled labor to team owners and leagues who rake in billions by exploiting that very same labor. Sadly, though, many pro athletes do eventually become capitalists. This is why the accusation of hypocrisy towards so-called champagne socialists such as Hassan Piker are so completely off base. And this is not to wag my finger at my fellow lefties who find some edgy catharsis in belting out "eat the rich" from time to time. But it's important to remember the full quote where this slogan came from: "When the people shall have nothing more to eat, they will eat the rich." This brings me to the last major criticism of capitalism I want to mention here. There are plenty more, but I really ought to move this along. Okay. Capitalists must maximize profit however they can, and profit is revenue minus expenses. How can they maximize revenue? Well, simply put, create a cheaply made product and sell it for as much as possible. How can they minimize expenses? Several ways, but among them is paying their employees as little as possible. Now, what happens if every capitalist does this, as they are incentivized to do? Well, now you've got a massive population of workers who don't have enough money to buy these shitty products. This is what this mall Santa looking guy calls the falling rate of profit, apparently. That's to say that capitalism fundamentally cannot find equilibrium. It is inherently unstable, and when the capitalist system suffers one of these economic heart attacks, those rich folks start to look real tasty all of a sudden. Let's bring this all back to mouthwashing, where our capitalist enterprise du jour is Pony Express, an allusion to a letter delivery company that operated in the Old West of the United States for about a year and a half starting in 1860. A reference to the back half of 19th century America is an interesting choice. It invokes the Gilded Age, a time of unfettered capitalist expansion. Writing on the period in A People's History of the United States, Howard Zinn notes, "And so it went, in industry after industry. Shrewd, efficient businessmen building empires, choking out competition, maintaining high prices, keeping wages low, using government subsidies. These industries were the first beneficiaries of the welfare state. By the turn of the century, AT&T had a monopoly of the nation's telephone system. International Harvester made 85% of all farm machinery, and in every other industry, resources became concentrated, controlled. The banks had interest in so many of these monopolies as to create an interlocking network of powerful corporation directors, each of whom sat on the boards of many other corporations. According to a Senate report of the early 20th century, J.P. Morgan at his peak sat on the board of 48 corporations, John D. Rockefeller 37 corporations. Along these lines, the tulpar resembles the company towns that emerged during this Gilded Age. A company town would be the location of a large business operation like a mine or a factory, where the same corporation that owned said business also owned either a majority or the entirety of the surrounding town, such as housing and stores. This allowed the corporation to double dip, exploiting their workers while on the job, then exploiting them again as captive consumers when they were off the clock. The vending machines on the tulpar certainly suggest that Pony Express has a similar setup going on here. What we see of life aboard the space freighter also highlights the psychological toll capitalism imposes upon workers. Specifically, I refer to what this Dr. Light cosplayer calls alienation, which manifests here in 4 unique ways. Firstly, under capitalism, workers have practically no say in the goods they make or the services they provide. This is seen rather starkly in mouthwashing, as the crew of the Tulpar have no clue what's in the cargo hold until they, in violation of company policy, crack it open themselves. If they had known that they were going on a year-long interplanetary trip to deliver some sugary swill, I'm sure that most of the cast would have opted out of this rather unnecessary journey. But that brings up the second aspect of alienation. Since the essentials of life, shelter, food, healthcare, are commoditized like everything else under capitalism, workers are compelled to take jobs to earn a wage. We do these jobs not because they make us happy or fulfill us in any way, but because they pay the bills. Mouthwashing makes a point of showcasing this kind of alienation explicitly in its text multiple times. Curly confesses to Jimmy that being a freighter captain isn't all that it's cracked up to be. In his last moments, Swansea laments his pursuit of a steady blue-collar job, wife, kids, and a mortgage, the idyllic consumerist lifestyle frequently promoted by capitalist interests as the American dream. Instead, Swansea ultimately concludes that his prior life as a raging alcoholic suited him better. The third form of alienation involves how workers are utterly divorced from nature. This is a game about 5 people living off of mouthwash while adrift in space. I'll leave it at that. Lastly, workers are alienated from each other. Simply put, since workers have to sell their labor to make a living, they are forced into competition against their peers for jobs. And this is precisely what I want to hone in on. Because this adversarial relationship between workers is on full display in mouthwashing. It is this disastrous erosion of mutual trust and solidarity that tears the crew apart. But to truly understand how toxic it can become, to the levels that we see in mouthwashing, we're going to need to examine how this specific type of capitalist alienation got supercharged under neoliberalism. Buckle up, we gotta speedrun some history here.
High wages and steady employment. First aid and health protection.
To fully explore how capitalism distorts our behavior, we must also analyze its frequent socio-political partner in crime, liberalism. Now, capitalism can and does exist with other forms of government, like absolute monarchy in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, for instance. But, more often than not, capitalism is paired with liberalism. And that's simply because liberalism is designed to facilitate capitalism. Indeed, the emergence of liberalism as the prevailing political ideology in the developed world was a key factor in capitalism becoming the dominant economic system. The core tenet of classical liberalism is that market exchange is the greatest good. So it goes that in the buying and selling of goods and services, both parties come away from a transaction better than when they entered, and market forces ensure this transaction is fair, which is a rather big assumption, of course, as this doesn't seem to account for things like monopolies. Since market exchange is supposedly the ideal problem-solving behavior, classical liberalism prescribes that state power must be used so far as to establish markets, but go no further. And when one examines capitalism, it becomes quite clear that it is highly dependent on such government intervention in order to function. Administering private property rights, the enforcement of contracts, and keeping the worker population in line through policing are just some of the functions that the liberal state eagerly provides in order to establish capitalism. This is also why liberties advertised by liberalism are more concerned about enabling market activity, rather than ensuring a truly free, happy, and flourishing citizenry where all are treated equally under the law. Chief among these liberties is, of course, the right to own private property, which, as we've discussed, translates to the right to exploit workers. And since liberalism creates and enforces a market society, this means its other so-called rights, e.g. free speech, free press, free association, can only be fully expressed by those who have adequate amounts of money. Take lawsuits, where the ability to afford legal fees grants wealthier individuals an advantage in both filing lawsuits and being able to stall them and drive up costs for their opponents in a war of attrition. My take on liberalism's rhetoric around liberties and democracy is that it's all just a marketing ploy, fittingly enough.
Never be afraid to mislabel a product.
It's important to remember that liberalism, in most cases, had to overthrow feudalism or absolutism in order to seize state power. The talk of democratic freedoms was a great way to sell the masses on a new political system, even though it excluded them in many of the same ways the old one did. For example, it wasn't until the presidential election of 1828, around 40 years after the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, that a majority of states in the Union allowed non-property holding white men to vote. Before that, only white men who owned private property could vote. And this was by design. The founding fathers of this country were overwhelmingly either plantation owners or wealthy merchants. Or in other words, they were capitalists. And it follows that they designed and created a system that promoted their interests. So yes, liberalism serves capitalism first and foremost. And as we've established, capitalism does not seek equilibrium. It is an inherently unstable system. As wealth concentrates into fewer and fewer hands at the top, this leaves the masses working harder than ever while being unable to make ends meet. This can only lead to all manner of social and political upheaval, which is exactly what happened in the 1930s. The Great Depression eroded trust in liberal governments around the world, putting their societies at a crossroads. The citizenry could do a real revolution by overthrowing the liberal state and installing something new, or they could buy into a fake revolution which would have the liberal state drop all pretense of serving the will of the people, instead devoting itself to violently enforcing the interests of capital. This would be fascism. Or the liberal state could do a reformist overhaul of itself, providing a social safety net for workers that would pacify their outrage and allow capitalism to continue operating. The last of these options is what happened here in the United States with the New Deal, with similar approaches implemented by many European nations following the Second World War. This era of reformist liberal governance is referred to as Fordism. Fordism tended to include welfare programs, regulations on industry, protections for labor organizing, as well as monetary and fiscal policy aimed at dampening the boom-to-bust shocks endemic to capitalism. These concessions to the working class of America and Europe were also motivated by the Soviet Union's growing influence and its presentation of an alternate system in socialism. Mollifying workers was seen as crucial to staving off potential revolutions or defections. All of this serves as an admission that classical liberalism's laissez-faire approach was misguided. That is, the approach of minimal government intervention based on the belief that markets would somehow magically regulate themselves. But Fordism was not alone in this effort to revise liberalism and remedy its faults. In August of 1938, in the waning years of the Great Depression, the Walter Lippmann Colloquium convened. Here, a new ideology began to take shape. We'll get back to this development in just a minute. Fast forward to the 1970s, and capitalism had gone and done it again. The stagflation crisis, when the industrialized economies of the world simultaneously experienced high unemployment and high inflation, had called Fordism, and liberalism in general, back into question. In order for capitalism to survive, it was going to need a new companion. Enter neoliberalism. While Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher are the most well-known champions of this new form of governance, their rise to leadership positions merely represented its entry into the political mainstream. The truth is, neoliberalism had been developing for decades at this point, dating back to the Walter Lippmann colloquium that I mentioned just a minute ago. It was advanced further by think tanks like the Monte Pelerin Society and notable advocates like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. Neoliberalism had already made significant political inroads at the time, but the 1970s economic crisis was its golden opportunity to supplant Fordism as the prevailing political theory, an opportunity neoliberals seized without hesitation. If you're familiar with the term, you might equate neoliberalism with a strictly political project aimed at reducing the size and role of government. This is certainly how it was advertised by the likes of Reagan and Thatcher. Many of their policies seem to reflect this, slashing welfare programs, rolling back regulations, cutting taxes on the highest income brackets and corporations, undermining labor union protections, and so on. This certainly gives the appearance that neoliberalism's main aim was to undo Fordist reforms and revert back to the free market of classical liberalism. There's some truth here. Neoliberals despise Fordism, but it also gets a few things wrong. The small government rhetoric was just that, rhetoric. If you look at government expenditure as a percentage of GDP, despite a couple of fluctuations, it has only grown in the neoliberal era of the past 45 years or so. And yes, both major political parties here in the US have embraced neoliberalism since the 1980s. Take a look at the third way for the Democrat Party's particular flavor of neoliberalism, if you're curious. In terms of spending, the United States government certainly did not shrink during the Reagan administration or in any meaningful way since. Simply put, neoliberalism is not about reducing or limiting government, but redirecting its resources and power. Instead of the state attempting to curb and stabilize capitalism's excesses as it did under Fordism, neoliberalism transformed the state into capitalism's eager co-conspirator. More importantly, both in general and for the purposes of this video, we must understand that neoliberalism is not just a set of policy prescriptions. Neoliberalism is a totalizing ideology, and contrary to the name, it is not a revival of classical liberalism, but instead a response to it. Whereas classical liberalism treats exchange as the highest virtue of markets, neoliberalism argues that competition is the ideal human behavior. Neoliberalism also greatly expanded the scope of this project. Instead of its predecessor's goal of creating a purely economic domain of market exchange apart from politics, neoliberalism aims to convert every aspect of life into a competitive marketplace, especially within the political sphere. This is most readily seen in the various school voucher programs implemented here in the United States. If you're unfamiliar, a school voucher allows parents or guardians to reallocate the share of tax revenue that a public school would receive for their child and use that money to enroll them in a private school instead. The public-facing rationale for this program was to foster competition in education, with the assumption that this would raise standards across public and private schools. I need to reiterate that neoliberalism is not just a political program in this way. It is a cultural and social one as well. As I said, its objective is to transform every part of human life into competitive marketplaces. While there's reason to be skeptical of her rhetoric, I believe Margaret Thatcher was being quite candid in this interview with the Sunday Times in 1981.
What's irritated me about the whole direction of politics in the last 30 years is that it's always been towards the collectivist society. People have forgotten about the personal society, and they say, do I count? Do I matter? To which the short answer is yes. And therefore, it isn't that I set out on economic policies, it's that I set out really to change the approach. And changing the economics is the means of changing that approach. If you change the approach, you really are after the heart and soul of the nation. Economics are the method. The object is to change the heart and soul.
In my opinion, this lays bare the intention of the neoliberal project. In order to completely poison the well of collective thought and action, neoliberalism sets out to change human relations on a foundational level.
And where was it science found that giant? In the atom, a particle so infinitely small that it takes over 100 billion atoms to make up the head of a pin. Just as other millions and quadrillions of atoms are the tiny building blocks.
First, neoliberalism entails a massive expansion of the field and scope of economics. Everything for which human beings attempt to realize their ends, from marriage to crime to expenditures on children, can be understood economically according to a particular calculation of cost for benefit. Secondly, this entails a massive redefinition of labor and the worker. The worker has become human capital. Salary or wages become the revenue that is earned on an initial investment, an investment in one's skills or abilities. Any activity that increases the capacity to earn income, to achieve satisfaction, even migration, the crossing of borders from one country to another, is an investment in human capital. This is the totalizing logic of neoliberalism. Every domain of life is subjected to economic calculation. Would going to college be a good return on investment? What's the best way to advertise myself on the dating market? Why are you wasting time on that hobby when you can turn it into a side hustle? Under neoliberalism, we are no longer people. We are now entrepreneurs. And yes, the irony is not lost on me as I say this on my monetized YouTube channel. This goes beyond the capitalist alienation I brought up before. We're not just workers scrambling for jobs, we're now tiny businesses locked in dog-eat-dog competition trying to grow our personal profits. So how and why did this happen? Let's start with the why. Why has neoliberalism ruled our lives for over 4 decades now? And why is it so fixated on turning us into entrepreneurs? I believe the answers are pretty simple here. The capitalist class champions neoliberal ideology because it's proven to be quite effective in advancing their interests on 2 fronts. The first front, it places us workers in a position of precarity, where capitalists can squeeze more and more productivity out of us while offering us less and less in return. What's more is how self-reinforcing the situation is, as it drives us to perpetuate and intensify this precarious environment. The progressive erosion of the rights attaching to the status of worker, the insecurity gradually created in the whole wage-earning class by new forms of employment, casual, provisional, temporary, greater ease of dismissal, the undermining of spending power to the point of impoverishing whole sections of the popular classes. These are so many developments that have led to a significant increase in the degree of dependence of workers on employers. This context of social fear has facilitated the establishment of neo-management in enterprises. In this respect, the naturalization of risk in neoliberal discourse, and the increasingly direct exposure of wage earners to market fluctuations through diminished protection and collective solidarity are simply 2 sides of the same coin. By transferring risks to wage earners, by generating an enhanced sense of risk, enterprises have been able to demand more flexibility and commitment from them. This does not mean that there is nothing new about neo-management and that capitalism is basically always the same. On the contrary, its major novelty consists in the molding, whereby individuals are rendered more capable of tolerating the new conditions created for them, and this even though they help to make these conditions increasingly harsh and abiding through their own conduct. In a word, the novelty consists in triggering a chain reaction by producing enterprising subjects who in turn will reproduce, expand, and reinforce competitive relations between themselves. In accordance with the logic of the self-fulfilling prophecy, this requires them to adapt subjectively to ever harsher conditions which they have themselves created. On that note, let's finally bring this back to mouthwashing. While the characters aren't obvious enterprising subjects like, say, rise and grind dropshipping influencers, we do see them take on precarious jobs aboard the Tulpar primarily out of a compulsion to advance their careers. Daisuke is here at the behest of his wealthy parents, who might have paid for his internship so that he could have some marketable experience on his resume. Similarly, Anya took on her position with the hopes of getting into medical school one day, presumably to enhance her work prospects and perhaps find a path out of poverty. But, of course, no one embodies how toxic this enterprising mentality is than our main subject, Jimmy. As Curly's hand-picked successor, his career has the clearest upward trajectory. That is, the most to lose. So when it all comes crashing down with the news of Pony Express's demise, and everyone realizing that they were going to need to sell themselves in the job market again, Jimmy immediately denigrates his fellow workers. Jimmy tears into Anya's lack of credentials and Daisuke's inexperience, even though he seems to be in a very similar situation himself, and points out Swansea's older age as attacks on their relative employability. He betrays his friend's confidence, twisting Curly's confession about wanting to change careers, and portraying it as Curly holding contempt towards the crew. Jimmy personifies what the blogger Splintering Bone Ashes calls negative solidarity, which is, instead of understanding that he shares the suffering with his fellow workers and empathizing and cooperating with them in order to improve their collective condition, he opts to air these petty grievances because he perceives that they aren't suffering as much as they should, or put another way, suffering as much as he thinks he is. He resents that he finds himself in the same situation as people with supposedly worse competitive standings than him. This also demonstrates the second front on which neoliberal ideology assures the triumph of capitalism. Casting humans as enterprises is a clever way to obscure the class divide. No longer are there capitalists and workers, now there are only enterprises of varying sizes. And by getting us workers to think in this way, our interests begin to align with those of capital. Job hunting is not much different from attracting investors, and our personal wages are now revenue. Seeing our fellow workers as competing enterprises makes organization and collective action very difficult, both of which are the biggest threats to the reign of capitalism. This is why I find Swansea to be such a fascinating character. At first glance, he resembles the stereotype of an out-of-touch boomer to me, specifically in that he seems to have a pretty stable career and domestic life, owning a house on a blue-collar salary. In other words, he seems like a person who may have experienced life before neoliberalism. While he expresses disapproval for his younger co-workers here and there, Swansea seems much more detached from career pressures than they are. He displays an awareness of the realities of work and how they can make people jaded and cynical. But he doesn't use this as an excuse to be callous. In the final act, when things start falling to shit in a hurry, Swansea proves to be a real one. He genuinely mourns Daisuke, remarking that it was really his bright-eyed intern who could have taught him something. We see Anya confiding in him at a certain point. Also, it's pretty clear that whoever Swansea was planning on saving the last cryopod for, it was not for himself. And while he shows hostility and contempt towards Jimmy in his final scene, I detect an undertone of trying to steer Jimmy away from the hollow pursuits of careerism. In this way, Swansea indicates that the mercenary attitude of neoliberal subjects is not always a foregone inevitability. I hope you see why neoliberal ideology is imposed upon us, because it perpetuates and intensifies an unforgiving and unstable work culture where we are forced to take what we can. We've come to accept that job security and even mundane life goals like home ownership have slipped out of reach. On top of this, any form of solidarity or class consciousness has been thoroughly dissolved by the omnipresent framework of competition, leaving us isolated and alone. This only makes us more likely to take shittier jobs for shittier pay with fewer and fewer benefits. Down and down we go. But how do we come to embrace this enterprising mindset? What sort of mechanisms do the advocates of neoliberalism use to instill their ideology into us? Wendy Brown explains one such technique called, funnily enough given the topic of this video, responsibilization. Responsibilization, on the other hand, especially as a social policy, is the moral burdening of the entity at the end of the pipeline. Responsibilization tasks the worker, student, consumer, or indigent person with the discerning and undertaking the correct strategies of self-investment and entrepreneurship for thriving and surviving. It is in this regard a manifestation of human capitalization, as it discursively denigrates dependency and practically negates collective provisioning for existence. Responsibilization solicits the individual as the only relevant and wholly accountable actor. As with other aspects of neoliberalism, responsibilization is totalizing and manifests in a myriad of ways and on a variety of levels. One example of responsibilization would be the individual mandate of the Affordable Care Act, commonly known as Obamacare. Instead of healthcare being a social good or collective concern, the ACA places responsibility on individuals to buy their own health insurance from private companies or face paying a tax penalty. And yes, this is essentially a nationalization of a neoliberal policy cooked up by then Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney. This use of incentives and penalties for individual behavior is integral to responsibilization, and unfortunately, you might be very familiar with these from your workplace. Apparatuses of rewards and sanctions, and systems of incentives and disincentives will ultimately replace market sanctions in guiding individual choices and conduct where market or quasi-market situations are not wholly feasible. Systems for the monitoring and evaluation of conduct will be constructed, whose results will condition the receipt of rewards and avoidance of sanctions. The expansion of evaluative technology as a disciplinary mode rests on the fact that the more individual calculators are supposed to be free to choose, the more they must be monitored and evaluated to obviate their fundamental opportunism and compel them to identify their interests with those of the organization employing them. We see this all over the place in mouthwashing. Pony Express, in particular, loves to monitor and to punish its employees for suboptimal performance or perceived misconduct. In the first scene, when Jimmy intentionally steers the ship into the path of an asteroid, we see an automated system re-engage the autopilot and deduct a penalty from the crew's pay. The company posters around the ship mentioned sanctions for injuries and poor team synergy, and when opening the cargo bay, Swansea protests over the loss of pay that would result. So why is it so important that we recognize how our attitudes and behaviors are being shaped and molded by neoliberalism? Here, I believe mouthwashing is making a statement. Another phrase that the game flashes on screen is kills 99%. This of course references the claim made by the in-universe Dragon Breath mouthwash that it kills 99.9% of all germs. But I'm sure I'm not the first person to note that this could be an allusion to the Occupy Wall Street movement and its slogan, "We are the 99%. The Occupy movement was in large part a response to the Great Recession that resulted from the 2007 to 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, and the United States government's role in both causing and addressing this crisis. The long and short of it is that due to deregulation, large banks were enabled to engage in highly risky ventures, which naturally blew up in their faces. Deemed too big to fail, these banks were bailed out by the federal government with hundreds of billions of dollars. What this amounted to was using tax revenue, paid for largely by working Americans facing the brunt of this economic crisis, to keep afloat the private firms who were most responsible for causing the crisis. The CEOs and other executives of these companies enjoyed generous severance packages despite their disastrous mismanagement, golden parachutes, if you will. Meanwhile, millions of working people lost their jobs and their homes. This was the main grievance of Occupy Wall Street. The government had shown, despite its promise of democracy, that it was completely captured by the 1%, the ultra-wealthy capitalist class. The 99% in the Occupy slogan, "We are the 99%, is us, the working class. I interpret what mouthwashing communicates by flashing both take responsibility and kills 99% is that these two notions are tightly coupled. The force destroying social bonds and making everything a matter of personal responsibility is the exact same force that is killing us, the 99%. This force is neoliberalism. It is neoliberalism that leverages powerful, all-encompassing systemic pressures in order to manufacture our behavior. The resulting behavior looks awfully a lot like what we see in the tragedy of mouthwashing. With that in mind, it's important that we don't moralize this conditioned antisocial behavior as some sort of personal failing. Let me be very clear here because I know how the internet works. False dichotomy is the bread and butter, or should I say the pancake and waffle of internet discourse. So let me emphasize that this by no means is arguing that Jimmy should not be held accountable for his quite frankly deplorable actions. Two things can simultaneously be true here. Jimmy should answer for the horrendous things he did, and that Jimmy is also a product of the culture and material conditions he lives in. Furthermore, this narrow-minded individual moralization is part of the problem here. To hold someone like Jimmy to account, and to hopefully rehabilitate them so that they stop hurting those around them, we must abandon this carceral mindset. To truly create accountability, and to fix our society so that it isn't producing folks like Jimmy all the time, we need to restore our sense of collective awareness and responsibility, and our ability to act socially. To do that, we need to replace the system. We need to end neoliberalism. The reason why we feel so connected to the crew members of the Tulpar is that their situation reflects the dark reality of neoliberalism under which we live. In them, we relate to the desperate dependence on our careers and the competitive mindset that instills in us. We feel the resulting erosion of communal bonds, the complete void of trust and solidarity, if not the presence of hostility between workers. We know what it's like to face a catastrophe in which our individual actions are worse than useless. This is us. But I don't like to end on a dark note. So please, please, please do not take this video as an invitation to wallow in doomerism. Saying that, this, of course, begs the question, what can we do? Well, I hope that by raising our awareness of how neoliberalism functions, we can inoculate ourselves to some of its most pernicious and insidious elements. As for actions, we should take note of how neoliberalism is desperately trying to diminish our ability to think and act collectively. In other words, we should do the things that it doesn't want us to do. Organize with your fellow workers, your fellow tenants, etc. Build community by helping those in need around you. Work to replace the culture of competition with a culture of care. No system lasts forever, but systems only change when we change them. Thanks for watching.